This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
This is the second presentation in the Royal Australian Artillery Historical Company's Firepower Lessons from the Great War seminar series. This is the 11th seminar, The Western Front, Breaching the Hindenburg Line, and the second presentation is presented by Colonel Jason Cooke and covers Walter Coxen as the CRA.
Good evening all, and it is a great privilege to be here tonight and to present to you one of Australia's unassuming masterminds of our profession, which in my opinion has much to teach us, and that is Major Gen Walter Adam Coxen, CV, CNG, DSO. My aim this evening is to start that awareness. How did a Queensland Garrison artillery officer become accredited with having commanded more artillery pieces than any other Australian in history? How did this mathematician, with his prowess for siege artillery and in-depth passion for ordnance, help shape the success of the battlefields of the Somme in 1916? Why did Sir John Monash listen to his artillery advice in supporting the Mark V British tanks in the Battle of Le Hainaut? And finally, what role did he have in the attack on the Hindenburg Line in 1918? To be honest, I didn't know this when I suggested it to Nick 5 years ago, that we should have snippets about influential artillery commanders. So my motivation was this sad-looking wall-mounted reminder that Walter Adam Coxen even existed. Tonight I can finally solve that problem that every subby that served in 215, 210 had when the CO used to ask us to talk about the dead commanders on the walls. So who was Coxen, and why do we need to know him? The scope of my presentation is to consider the performance of the 1st Australian Corps Artillery Commander, how was he prepared for his battle role, and future head of artillery. To do this, I've used the normal resources, but there's really scant information on Coxen. Luckily, there's a whole personal collection down at Port Queenscliff, and I have materials tonight from his war diaries and his personal records. Some of them are fascinating. To that end, I'll acknowledge the wonderful support I had from the Army History Unit and the team down at Fort Queenscliff. My wife actually enjoyed it after 4 hours of doing research. So the handout has his history. I'm just going to highlight some of the things which I think are important about how he was developed before the war. The first observation was he came from wealth, which gave him education. He was born into a wealthy English family where his dad was educated at Eton, but after suffering a gunshot wound to his right hand, which rendered him almost useless, he was sent to the colony to care for his aunt and uncle. This allowed Walter the ability to be educated at Toowoomba and Brisbane grammar schools. Please note the connection with Chevelle. Before RMC and the School of Artillery in 1911 was formed, the only training that was given was to permanent garrison artillery officers. Coxen was obviously one of them, but he was also sent to England, where he completed, with honours, the long course in coastal defence and siege artillery. But he also trained in artillery, field artillery, at Aldershot. Of course, Horner points out in the gunners the other serious senior commanders that we had at the same time that went through that college training. My next observation was that he was an instructor of School of Artillery. Right at the time when artillery was being, the lessons learnt from the South African Boer Wars was being evaluated and procedures and techniques were being developed. It was making gunnery more scientific back then. Here's an extract from one of his personal letters. Please note, he was the first to do a federal school of field and garrison artillery training at Queenscliff. Then in 1907, he was sent back to England again, this time for 3 years, to do more training, but in ordnance at Woolwich. So my observations of Cox's life history and his diaries is fascinating. And he was fascinated with long-range artillery and ordnance. Going through his artefacts, That's where he spent most of his energy. Over and over again, before the war, during the war, and after the war, he gave numerous lectures about cordite, long-range artillery, long-barrel guns, ordnance, employment of heavy artillery. In fact, there's a great photo down the Queen's Cliff of him firing a long-barrel gun at Marcus Hill. So, what does this mean? Was he at the right place, right time, with the right training? I don't think so. However, something was making this work for Australia because he was just about to get the next plum job. Coxen was perfectly placed to be given Lieutenant Colonel at the beginning of the AIF on the 21st of May 1915 and to raise the 36th Heavy Artillery Group, known as the Australian Siege Brigade. Now, this was the only unit to leave Australia with exclusively regular army officers and men, 412 to be honest. It was also the first fighting unit to reach France in February 1916. Hence why David Horner also stated that the HAG deserved special mention because it was the only permanent Australian artillery unit to serve in the war. Next observation. Coxen was appointed over more experienced gunners. Coxen mixed out on the opportunity of serving with the colonial forces in either of the world wars and therefore had no war experience. Yet he was just appointed as the commander of the only Australian permanent artillery unit to serve in the war. Now, armies are armies, and I doubt that this would have pleased everyone. Please note the names of Bessel Jones, Johnson and Grimwell. The 36th HAG saw action in the British 17th Corps near Arras before it moved south and joined the British 4th Army in the Battle of the Somme. The rest of 1916, Coxen commanded the brigade on the Somme, taking part of many of the operations that the 4th Army fought. However, you have to realise that at the beginning of the war there was a shortage of guns, let alone heavy artillery pieces, and so the two batteries were usually split up and supporting different British units and Australian units within the same Army Corps. This gave Coxen a great advantage because he could then serve on higher headquarters, gaining much valuable experience at that level. It was also where he could provide his expertise as a gunnery artillery officer, a garrison artillery officer who had ordnance certification. With this in mind, Coxen saw the results of Fremel's, and as he was appointed the assistant to the general officer commanding within the 18th Corps Heavy Artillery. He was their liaison officer. Coxen's experience gained through 1916 was adding to the tension amongst artillery officers, especially those in the British forces, as they competed for recognition. Most of the senior artillery officers and staff officers came from field and horse artillery, yet the techniques required on the static battlefield were more like those of garrison artillery. Coxen's case highlighted when Birdwood was looking to appoint the CRA of the 3rd Division. Birdwood suggested Coxen, but however Grimwell got the job. That was to serve Australia very well. So for 1916, was really good for another name that they used to call him, which was Wacky Coxen. When you piece together the short supply of heavy artillery in 1916 and the impact they were beginning to have, and the new and emerging techniques of sound ranging and the development of catching battery fire, the emerging techniques of barrages and the role of heavy artillery had in those set pieces, Coxen was definitely in the right place. I think there's a lesson to be taken there. My hypothesis is that Coxen was taking advantage of the coastal siege artillery into the trench warfare of the Somme. However, this was a bit of a stretch of imagination. Coxen got it, and so did Birdwood. The Somme had brought structural changes to artillery, which the previous presenter just highlighted. The first being the arrangements by which the General Officer Commanding Royal Artillery of the Corps commanded all the Corps artillery, which was already in place with the 1st Anzac Corps. And secondly, the creation of the Corps or Army assets, which could be then allocated as required. For Coxen, who had already commanded a large heavy artillery group within the 2nd British Corps, and Burwood's recognition of his skills, promoted Colonel Coxen and appointed him CRA 1 Division at the temporary rank of Brigadier General. He served this capacity throughout the German withdrawal to the Hindenburg Line. All this time, the tactics of artillery, on which success in battle now relied, became more and more refined, complex and sophisticated. In line with the Australian government's policy that all senior posts should be held by Australians, Coxen then took over as the head of the Australian Artillery, known as General Officer Commanding Australian Corps Artillery. The quote I've got you there was actually before he became that position, before he took on that position, but it goes to the heart of his mind, and he was actually telling and preparing the guns for the Battle of Hamel that came out of his war diary. Remember I previously spoke about the tension within senior artillery officers? Coxen was appointed to the senior Australian gunner, which probably why he got the name of boss gunner. But Johnson and Grimwell now reported to him. In fact, a little snippet, Johnson became so upset of Coxen's appointment that he was asked to be sent home, of which General Burbage replied, said yes. On the screen and in the handouts, I've just got a couple of little snippets over the next little while of his 1917 war diary. I will now spend a bit of time providing insights into Coxen, who he was as a man, and this may go to his approach and style. It was said of him that if he had not been a captain in arms, then he would have been a captain of industry. Good temper and a vivid sense of humour characterises this man of action. Gifted with keen insight and an outsized memory, he never forgot faces or facts. In fact, his watchword was efficiency. He was tall, well-built with strong features and a self-possessed and dignified manner. He was a good public speaker with a pleasing, well-modulated English voice, and upon retirement sometimes gave radio talks for the Australian Broadcasting Commission. But if I had to sum up his approach and style, it would be the following. Mathematician, 2 periods of training in England, siege and coastal gun training with a smattering of field guns. The long course ordnance before the war, extensive command positions on high headquarters, application of the Somme training, of siege training into the Battle of the Somme, the absorption of new technology, allowing him to effectively use heavy artillery for a different purpose than that of field guns. I think in short amount of time that I've had to understand Coxen, his performance as DOCRA 1 Anzac Corps can be defined by his watchword of efficiency. He was always taking facts, techniques, improvements and applying them to the battlefield. Horner writes, for the final battles of World War I, the Australian Corps drove the German defenders back and mentions Monash juggling his divisions to maintain pressure, and specifically that each division was supported by artillery. He then goes on to mention that Coxen used the Australian and British Army brigades to lend support to each divisional attack. This advance saw the Australian artillery at its best. After 4 years of war, it had been brought to a high level of expertise. Staff work and accuracy and improved and efficiency liaison procedure had been established. We've previously seen in Dr. Williams Westerman's presentation on Villiers Brett, we saw the evidence that artillery was agile and responsive, more than just set pieces of barrage fire support. Evidence of this was that the artillery unit's responsiveness to the unknown locations that the Germans were trying to probe and retake the town. Then in General Stevens' presentation on the Amiens offensive, he summarised the evolution that occurred where the artillery was being used in an offensive manner rather than just to protect the troops. Infantry no longer owned the guns, as the assets were essentially controlled, allowing the infantry to do their thing, whilst artillery was being utilised more strategically in a layering effect, exploiting the strengths of each type. horse artillery for mobility, field guns for creeping barrages and or jump barrages, large calibers for counter battery fire, and heavy artillery for specific hard targets or interdiction. Monash started the shift in taking and using advancing technology and exploiting its strengths. Technology such as round ranging, as we heard in the previous presentation, calibration, accuracy of maps, aerial photography and communications enable greater success for the indirect assets to engage, harass, neutralise and generally disrupt and cause mayhem. I put it to you that General Coxen, as a senior Australian gunner, had a vital role in his development and he strove for efficiency of cordite, long-barrelled guns, heavy artillery and taking his siege training and applying those fundamentals to the modern battlefield. The final plan for the 4th Army involved 1,386 field guns and howitzers, 684 heavy guns, making up 27 medium artillery brigades and 13 heavy brigades, batteries, in addition to the infantry divisional artillery. Major General Budworth was GOCRA 4th Army, but the fire plan for the 4th Army's artillery was devised by Monash's senior artillery officer, the boss gunner Coxen. The final number of guns that Coxen had to hit the Hindenburg line was the following: 492 18-pounders, 18 13-pounders, 105.5 howitzers, 108 60-pounders, 194 6-inch, 60 8-inch, 28 9.2, 6 12-inch, 28 6-inch, total of 1,086 guns. And he's got a listing of every single calibre and numbers of it. Fascinating. Up there is a slide that's from General Budworth praising Coxen for the events that started the Ardennes offensive. I'll just give you a moment to read that and highlight the 4 points: putting the guns and ammunition into positions, the accuracy and effect of the barrage fire, the effective counter-battery work, and the bold and successful way in which the advance of the artillery to support the infantry was carried out. I reckon there's many lessons learned that we can take from his history, the way he applied it, and the way and the information out of his diaries. I've tried to summarise them there in 4 different points, which we may want to talk about maybe in the planetary session. Thank you very much.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.